My model Stefano here has light blue or light gray blue eyes, I guess. The distinction I want to make here is that they are lighter as compared to, say, my eye color, which is brown, so that would be a darker eye color. The overall color is not the most important thing in the world, of course. We don't have the tools to deal with colors here anyway. The important thing is the value of the iris and how it stacks up in the grand scheme of other eye color values. That's a long way of saying that what really matters here is whether we are dealing with somebody who has light or dark eyes. We are dealing with lighter eyes. An important thing for us then to consider is not sinking the iris shape, the negative bowl shape, so deep within the eyeball that it becomes completely black. If you take a look at some of the closer shots here, you will see that the inside corner of the eye is actually darker than the value of the iris. This is the case on my finished sculpture, and it's the case on our model as well. So there is a relationship between the value of the iris and the value around the eye, and I try to mimic that relationship. If the color of the eyes were darker, dark brown for example, then this relationship would be reversed. The iris would be darker than the areas around it, and my sculpture would then need to communicate that. This is an easy way, or a fairly easy way, for you to determine what should be done with the eyes that you are sculpting. Simply study the value relationship that exists between the iris and the areas around the eye. Which one is darker? Here on my model, we find values around the eyes which are darker than those inside the iris. Therefore, we will not dig so deep and instead leave the bowl shape of the iris fairly shallow so that the value doesn't become too dark. This solution is, of course, dependent on lighting condition, and in such a way, it is an extremely fragile solution. However, most solutions regarding eyes or the visual appearance of anything are fragile solutions, highly dependent on lighting conditions. And if we choose not to go the route of visual appearance, but rather represent exactly what is there, which is a bulge on top of a sphere of the eyeball, then the result we end up with is something that looks really strange and actually ends up looking like somebody who is blind. Like they have really pale, bright eyes. Now, sculpture sadly suffers the fate of always being reliant upon lighting condition, whether we'd like it to or not. So I think it's something we shouldn't consider or concern ourselves with too deeply. We kind of just have to be at peace with it. I find the same to be true when it comes for sculptures in the round. Not every sculpture needs or is going to look perfect or super interesting from 360 degrees. Sometimes there are views which look better or are preferable, and that is okay. For example, with the sculpture we are doing here, a portrait, it's going to be really hard to sculpt a portrait that's equally as interesting from 360 degrees. However, what we can do and should strive to do is to sculpt a portrait or a sculpture in general that functions well from 360 degrees. The eyebrows are perhaps the last missing feature, or thing, I suppose, I guess it's not a feature, that we need to implement into our sculpture. Normally, I would suggest adding this feature at a much earlier stage, though I'm a little dubious of that advice the more I kind of work, to be honest. Now, the shape of the eyebrow makes up a decent amount of the character you are sculpting, or it can at least. So, then why am I introducing it so late here? Well, if you look carefully, the eyebrows that we have here on Stefano, they lay pretty much right on top of the fullness of the brow ridge, or the supraorbital ridge, if we want to be fancy. That's the bone that runs along it's the part of the bone that runs along the upper edge of the eye socket, the name for the part of the bone. This bony ridge is often partially covered by the hair of the eyebrow. Well, almost always, but depending on how you pluck or how your eyebrows grow, it can be more or less covered. And sometimes they are sitting pretty much right on top of each other, which is kind of what we have here. So, what we have here is the shape of the supraorbital ridge itself ends up being the shape of the hair of the eyebrow, which is why it kind of looks like I almost have semi-eyebrow shapes on there already, even before I started working on them. And as I'm drawing these on, you can see it's pretty much right on top of those shapes that I've established as being the upper sections of the eye sockets, not the flesh that hangs below the bony edge. Depending on your subject, you might find it necessary to introduce the eyebrows earlier. Sometimes they matter more than others. Some people will have really sharply angled eyebrows, and if that's the case, it's going to dictate the mood they give off. Here, however, they are not so significant in that sense. They don't impact the way that Stefano looks as much as they potentially does or do in some other people. And so introducing them later is going to work just fine, I think. The eyebrows are drawn onto the surface first as really simple shapes. Now, remember that any curved shape should be broken down into straight lines and constructed back together again into a curve from all of these straight line segments. And we spoke about that in an earlier video, probably one of the first videos in the series. In this way, we find the particular in regards to the curve we are examining. And most curves on the human body are going to have a really particular character that you have to capture. If we were drawing this, I probably would suggest drawing with straight lines, but since we are, drawing on paper, but since we are sculpting, you can kind of round these lines off a little bit more. They don't have to be straight. The most important thing is that we break them down into straight line segments in our mind so that we can find the particular character that the curves have. In order to communicate to our viewer that what they are looking at is in fact hair, we need to resort once again to using visual appearance over realistic representation. Why, you might ask? Why can't we just realistically represent what we see here? Well, we're sculpting eyebrows, and clay doesn't like to turn into nanomillimeter thick hairs. They can be squeezed into hairs, but by using an extruder, but I don't think we need to discuss why that's a bad idea.